Three superpowers mobilized within 48 hours. Beijing made the call, Moscow provided support, Tehran called it piracy. Washington stood alone. But is this a coincidence? The first week of January, the US stopped an oil tanker off Venezuela's coast. It seemed like a routine sanctions enforcement. But what followed was anything but routine, because the reactions that came next signaled a new balance in the world order. The first response came from China, just 24 hours later. At the daily press briefing at the Foreign Ministry in Beijing, spokesperson Guo Jiakun took the podium and used harsh language. China opposes illegal unilateral sanctions, he said. But what really caught attention was this. Beijing characterized this action as one lacking basis in international law and carried out without UN Security Council authorization. This wasn't just a diplomatic protest. This was a clear message sent to Washington. You cannot set the rules alone. The second response came from Moscow, and this response was much more direct. The Kremlin announced that President Putin had a phone conversation with Venezuelan leader Maduro. The call took place just hours after the tanker seizure. Look at the timing. Tanker stopped. Hours later, Putin picked up the phone. The message was clear. Russia was showing that Caracas is not alone, and not just with words, but with action. Because during the call, the two leaders decided to accelerate ongoing energy projects. Russian companies will increase oil production in Venezuela. Trade agreements will be expanded. Economic cooperation will deepen. The third response came from Iran. Tehran Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei described the U.S. action as state-sponsored piracy. The word choice was striking: piracy. That is, an action outside international law, illegitimate, criminal in nature. Iran went even further. Baghaei called on other countries to oppose this action. The international community should act against this the same way it acts against piracy, he said. In other words, Washington's action was being put in the same category as the actions of Somali pirates. Now let's evaluate these three responses as a whole. China deployed its economic power, Russia its strategic support, Iran its ideological rhetoric. Three different countries, three different methods, but one goal: to send Washington the message, you cannot act alone. And this is where a critical question emerges. Was this coordinated response a coincidence, or was it a pre-planned strategy? Experts believe more in the second possibility, because there has been deepening cooperation between China, Russia, and Iran in recent years. Regular summits under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, joint military exercises, economic agreements, energy trade, technology transfers. These three countries are trying to build an alternative system to the Washington-centered world order. A multipolar world vision. An international system where not one power but multiple powers have a say. And the Venezuela crisis became a perfect testing ground for this vision. So how does this triple alliance work? What does each country gain? What does it lose? Let's look one by one. For China, Venezuela is a strategic partner. Why? Because Venezuela is one of Beijing's most reliable allies in Latin America. China has invested billions of dollars in Venezuela. It makes oil purchases. It finances infrastructure projects. In return, it gains access to Venezuela's massive oil reserves. But China's goal isn't just oil. This is part of a bigger game. Beijing is trying to increase its own influence in Latin America, Washington's traditional sphere of influence. Every new ally is a blow to America's regional hegemony. Therefore, Venezuela's survival is in China's interest. If the Maduro administration falls and a pro-American government comes to power, Beijing loses one of its most important footholds in the region. That's why China is taking such a clear stance against Washington in the Venezuela crisis. Now let's look at Russia. For Moscow, Venezuela is not just an economic partner, but a geopolitical tool. Russia is trying to regain the global influence it lost after the Cold War. And one way to do this is to gain strong allies in Washington's backyard. Venezuela is Russia's strongest foothold on the American continent. There's a strategic partnership agreement between the two countries. Russian military advisors are in Venezuela. Russian weapons are in the Venezuelan army. Russian companies are in Venezuela's oil industry. Putin's call to Maduro is no coincidence. This is a message to the world. The Western Hemisphere is no longer just America's. We're here too. Russia is also using Venezuela as a buffer against Western sanctions. By working together, the two countries are trying to reduce the impact of American sanctions. Energy trade, arms sales, technology transfers, all are ways to circumvent sanctions. And Iran. Tehran is establishing an ideological bond with Venezuela. Both countries are regimes that Washington has declared enemies, Both have been under heavy sanctions for years. Both are resisting Western intervention. It's known that Iran provides technical support to Venezuela, especially in the oil industry. Iranian engineers are working in Caracas to renovate Venezuela's old refineries and increase production capacity. But Iran's real gain is symbolic. To show the world this, we are not alone. There are others resisting American pressure, and together we are strong. This is where the common ground of these three countries converges. All are challenging Washington's unipolar world order. All are trying to build an alternative system. And the Venezuela crisis is the most visible front of this struggle. But there's another dimension to this story. This triple alliance doesn't stop at rhetoric. Concrete steps are also being taken. For example, joint military exercises. In recent years, Chinese, Russian, and Iranian ships conducted exercises together for the first time. In the Indian Ocean, in the Persian Gulf, even in the Pacific. These exercises carry a message. We can work in coordination, we can combine our naval power, and if necessary, we can act jointly against Washington. Economic cooperation is also deepening. Trade in their own currencies is increasing between China, Russia, and Iran. Efforts to reduce dollar dependence are accelerating. New payment systems are being established. Alternative mechanisms to SWIFT are being developed. Even more is being discussed, a joint digital currency. The central banks of the three countries are working on this. If it happens, there will be a major crack in the global financial system, because dollar hegemony will be seriously shaken for the first time. And on the technology front, China's 5G technology, Russia's military systems, Iran's drone technology, all three are being shared, developed, spread. Dependence on Western technology is decreasing. They're building their own ecosystem. So how does Washington view all this? American foreign policy circles are raising alarms because for the first time since the Cold War, such a strong and coordinated bloc is forming against the US. And this bloc isn't based solely on military power. It has economic, technological, ideological dimensions. Some analysts say, during the Cold War, the Soviets were alone. Now Washington faces an axis formed by China, Russia, and Iran. This is a much harder game. But Washington isn't backing down. On the contrary, it's hardening its strategy. More sanctions, more pressure, more military presence, simultaneous operations against Venezuela, Iran, Russia. And here's where the critical question emerges. Can Washington really fight on three fronts at the same time? History shows this is very difficult. Even in World War II, America acted together with allies. It didn't fight alone on two fronts. Now there's China, Russia, Iran, three separate powers, three separate regions, three separate challenges. And the ally front, Europe, is anxious. Some EU countries are uncomfortable with Washington's aggressive policies. They want to continue trading with China. They don't want to completely burn bridges with Russia. And they're not very willing to support American intervention in Latin America. Therefore, Washington is more alone than before. It used to say, Western Bloc, NATO was behind it, allies supported it. Now there are cracks. Unity has weakened, consensus has broken, and right now, the China-Russia-Iran triangle is strengthening. This trio is acting together not only in Venezuela but in other regions too, in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan. Everywhere they're challenging Washington's policies. Everywhere they're proposing an alternative order. Some experts call this the new Cold War. But actually, this definition is incomplete, because the Cold War was a bipolar competition, capitalism and communism. Now there's a much more complex picture. China has a capitalist economy, but an authoritarian political system. Russia uses free market mechanisms but follows a nationalist foreign policy. Iran is a theocratic regime but a regional power. So ideologically they're very different. But their goal is the same: to break American hegemony. This is the birth of what's called the multipolar world order. Multiple power centers, multiple economic systems, multiple political models, and all together competing, sometimes conflicting, sometimes cooperating. So how will this order take shape? There are two basic scenarios. First scenario, peaceful competition. Each power works in its own sphere of influence. Conflict is avoided. Diplomacy is kept in the foreground. Economic cooperation continues. The world reaches a fragmented but stable balance. Second scenario, open conflict. Tensions escalate. Economic war turns into kinetic war. Proxy wars multiply. Blocs harden. and eventually a major crisis erupts. Which scenario will happen? Nobody knows for sure. But the Venezuela crisis is an indicator. If this escalates uncontrollably, we're heading for the second scenario. If the parties can manage the tension, the first scenario is possible. What do we see so far? Mixed signals. On one hand, harsh rhetoric, military movements, sanctions. On the other hand, diplomatic channels are open, trade continues, bridges aren't completely burned. But the critical point is this: China, Russia, and Iran have displayed a common stance on Venezuela. This means we can see the same coordination in other crises in the future. Think about it. If there's tension in Taiwan tomorrow, will Russia and Iran support China? If the conflict in Ukraine grows, will China and Iran stand behind Russia? If a new crisis breaks out in the Middle East, will China and Russia support Iran? The Venezuela crisis showed that the answer is probably yes, because these three countries are now building not just diplomatic solidarity, but a strategic alliance. And Washington knows this. That's why it's worried, because never in history has America faced such a powerful counterblock. So what happens next? In the short term, this tension over Venezuela will continue. Tankers will be stopped, sanctions will increase, China, Russia, Iran will continue to provide support. Verbal exchanges continue, sometimes there will be small clashes. In the medium term, we may see similar crises in other regions, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East. Everywhere competition between Washington and China, Russia, Iran will escalate. In the long term, a new world order will take shape. Will American hegemony end? Maybe not, but it will definitely weaken. The multipolar system will settle, and the world will become more complex, more unpredictable, but perhaps more balanced. In conclusion, we can say this: the joint response of China, Russia, and Iran within 48 hours in the Venezuela crisis was not a coincidence. This was strategic coordination, and this coordination is the first concrete sign of the new world order. Washington can no longer set the rules alone. Other powers are at the table, and they're having their say too. Voices are rising, positions are hardening, alliances are deepening. The world is changing, the balance is shifting, and the China-Russia-Iran triangle is the engine of this change. So what do you think? Can this triple alliance really challenge Washington? Or is it strong on paper, weak in practice? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you like this analysis, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel, because we'll continue to closely follow these changes in world politics.